Hello and welcome to the third session of our program, Enabling Innovation and Invention. And I'd like to thank our sponsor, Qualcomm, for supporting this program. I'm Kenneth Cukier, a senior editor at The Economist and the host of the Babbage podcast, and the co-author of a book called Framers on the Power of Mental Models and the Limits of AI. So we've already heard a lot about the promise of 5G and all of the ways in which it's going to transform so many aspects of society and the economy. Now, if you think about technologies, all technologies, whether it was the water wheel or whether it was steam power or electricity or 4G technology, it transformed the economy and then transformed all the ways in which people interact with one another and how they work done. 5G will do the same thing. Now we want to take the focus, narrow the aperture, and look at what it means for invention and for innovation. And the good news is we have some terrific people to help us unpack these deep themes. Let me introduce you to them now. The first one is David Kappos, a partner at Cravath, Swaine & Moore. Hello, David. Michelle Zatlyn, who is the co-founder, chief operating officer, and president of Cloudflare. Hello, Michelle.
Hello.
Zorina Khan is a professor of economics at Bowdoin College. Hello, Zorina. And finally, Jamie Montgomery is a co-founder and the managing partner of March Capital. Hello, Jamie.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Great. Fantastic. Let me actually start with an unfair question that I'm going to sort of ask all of you, and I'm going to choose an order. And then I just want to hear this one one-word answer from you, which is that 5G is going to be important because all these other great technologies have been, whether it's the internet itself, or whether it is 4G, it's not going to be demonstrably more important. It's not going to be better. It's not going to be bigger. It's just going to be as important. It's going to be on par. It's not going to be under par, but it's not going to be demonstrably above par. Do you agree with my very stoic assessment of 5G, or do you actually think I'm wrong and that this is going to be a much bigger game changer? Michelle, why don't you start us off? Bigger or on par?
Bigger. I'll go with bigger. My one-word answer.
Fantastic. Zorina.
Unknowable.
Excellent. Truly an academic. Jamie.
Huge. Much bigger.
Much bigger. Okay, good, because huge actually wasn't a comparator, but okay. And David.
Gigantic.
That too doesn't answer the question. Bigger or hitting par?
Much bigger.
Much bigger. So why? And David, why don't you develop it first? And then we're going to get to Zorina and find out why she says it's unknowable. But clearly, Zorina is the only one who's correct, and you both are just wild optimists all three of you are wild optimists who just believe the hype. Now, I'm sure that's not true either. So David, tell me, why do you think it's going to be much, much bigger?
Well, two things, Ken. One is the enablement of business models that we can't imagine right now. We saw this with 4G. We've seen it with other major technological innovations where business models are created and the new genres of business are created by leaps in technology. And I think we're going to see that in ways we can't appreciate. But the reason I have faith is because while I can't appreciate them, I have seen this movie before with previous technological breakthroughs. The second reason, Kenneth, that I would tell you is that we'll unlock human potential, particularly human potential in unbanked, in lesser developed countries, in people who have not had the same opportunities as the rest of us in the highly developed part of the world. They're going to get the benefit of 5G and be able to participate in the world's economic activity and an opportunity in much bigger ways than they could in the past.
Okay. I'm going to come back to a few of these things in terms of the economic enfranchisement by 5G, but I first want to go to Michelle and have her explain why she thinks it's bigger. Please.
Well, no, I think what David laid out makes a lot of sense. And maybe just to double click on that a little bit more, if you just think about it, every time, so one of the premises of 5G is a lot faster or a much lower latency, which equates to speed. And in my line of work, I can just see as the internet is faster for all of us, whether it's in a business setting or at home, people use it more, and we create new things, new services that then consumes and becomes this flywheel effect. So imagine everything you're doing 10 times faster. All of a sudden, back to David's point about a new business model, what does that unlock in both an industrial setting or in a consumer setting? And it's probably hard for a lot of us to even imagine, but I promise you, there are some amazing innovators, developers out there imagining what they could do with a 10 times faster speed. What can you do in hospital settings or school settings or with augmented reality? All these things that we kind of see but don't really use and take full advantage of. I think 5G will enable all of those pieces, and it's gonna make everything much more immersive and richer than we see today. And I think we'll look back and be like, wow, this was so rudimentary how we were using the internet. It was almost like so two-dimensional. It's going to add a whole new dimension of what can get created. But those haven't been created yet. So it's a little bit of seeing the future. So it's like go back and read some of your favorite sci-fi books, because I think that's what's going to enable. And you might not be able to fully describe the mountain, but it's there. I think that's why I think it's a much bigger opportunity. And then, as David said, just bringing access to a lot more parts of the world that maybe don't have access to even 4G today, and where things are really slow. And it's like, well, how can we help move this forward? And so I think that's really, really interesting when you mix all of these different trends between devices becoming smarter, all these new technologies about augmented reality and video, coupled with this idea of much lower latency. Something special will be created.
Okay, so I believe you've evangelized it to such a degree that I'm certain that Cloudflare is going to change its name to Meta. Oh no, it's already taken. It can't be Metaverse, maybe instead of Meta Platforms. But Jamie, you're an optimist as well. You're a bull. Why?
I'm an investor. We build companies, and there's going to be trillions of dollars of wealth built in this area. 4G created about $1 trillion worth of GDP, incremental GDP, and a lot of it was the convergence of location data, payments, as well as 4G services, very consumer focused. The difference this time around is we're probably looking at a $10 trillion impact economically. So 10 is bigger than 1. I would point that out just for everyone out there. But I'd also say that the impact, as Michelle was saying, is not just in the consumer space, but will also be in the industrial space and parts of the economy that probably haven't been impacted as much by IT yet. It could be in transportation with autonomous vehicles, big use case, certainly in healthcare, certainly in the industrial area. And these are, it will take longer to roll out. I mean, this is not a quick rollout, but the applications are enormous, and hence, our real interest and focus in this area.
Great. I am so pleased to hear our 3, thoughtful, incredible, extraordinary, full, and decent students, David, Michelle, and Jamie, give their answer to the first question. So I now implore Professor Khan to grade their responses. This was a quiz. This is not a test. Professor Khan, what grade do you give our three dutiful, thoughtful, studious students?
I'm an economist, and so I see both costs and benefits, and I also see 3 centuries of the history of technology. And I think that or 3 students or 3 participants are being very optimistic and very forward-looking, but perhaps not taking into account the subtleties and nuances of any technological change. In particular, I'd like to point out that we consider the role of technology. The greatest challenge to any innovative firm is not necessarily with coming up with the technology, but with monetizing it. And I agree completely with the comments that Jamie made, which is that businesses that are flexible and responsive are always going to be able to find ways in which they can profit from new innovations. And I think that it's quite clear that in the near term, that we'll see a lot of advances from the business to business end of it, which will translate into cost savings and productivity advances. But ultimately, the economy exists for consumers. And it's really not clear to me at this point in time whether the advances that we expect from 5G are necessarily going to be beneficial to consumers, or what consumers are going to be willing to pay, for instance, for, say, greater latency or speed or faster streaming. I think that in the long run, all of these enormously optimistic predictions will come true when the killer app emerges for 5G. But we're far, far away from that at this point.
So I think that's a very wise response. I'm clearly an easier grader than you because I gave everyone an A, with the exception of Jamie, who I give an A plus, because I actually think he's right. 10 is bigger than 1. Just saying. Okay. However, to embrace Michelle's wise point that when things are 10 times faster, we're going to get 10 times more of things. I wonder if we're going to get 10 times more misinformation and 10 times more hacks, 10 times more security threats. Let's go to these controversial areas. But first, I want to give a roll to talk about the cap of what might be coming down the pike. And in particular, let's put flesh on the bones. And I'll pick up on the last thing that Jamie had said, which is that 5G is going to enable connecting parts of the economy that hadn't been connected before, such as industrial applications like transport and healthcare. Is it in the nature, why is it in the nature of 5G to do what wasn't done with 4G or wasn't done with the wireline internet? Who wants to take that first?
I'll try. And thank you. In America, manufacturing is probably about 20% of our GDP. And you go to Korea, Germany, other parts of the world, it's closer to 50%. So, often you had to put a global hat on. This is a global industry. And why hasn't technology reached it? I think a lot of it has been a lack of standards in the operating technology world, how technology is used and consumed. IT standards have existed for the last 20, 25 years, which allowed the rapid rollout of the internet and deployment of technology throughout enterprises. It has not existed. It's now coming online. So you have a confluence of edge computing, standards of technology, AI, combined with 5G will have that impact.
Okay.
Well, and I can, no, and I think just to add to what Jamie said, the things are going a lot faster. So let me just give you some context. And sometimes it's when you zoom out, it's hard to see it. And so I'm an entrepreneur. I started my company 11 years ago. And when I started my company about 11 years ago, there was a term that someone came up with. Her name's Eileen Lee. And she's another great venture capitalist. And she created this term called a unicorn, when a technology company is worth over $1 billion in market cap. Okay. And this was a big deal when she did this about 10 years ago. And at the time, the data showed that on average, about 10 unicorns were being created every year. Okay. That was kind of, and when I started my company, we were absolutely one of those companies. And it was, I could tell you the peers, my year, the year before, after, it's all the, drop boxes. We kind of all started at the same time. There was our class. In 2021, year to date, there have been over 360 unicorns created this year. So in a decade, in less than a decade, how much faster these companies are getting created, valued, standing up, delivering value. And so if you might be like, my God, my head is spinning from all of the updates of whether Web3 and AI, and there's all these things. Facebook's now, Meta has come up now twice on this. What's going on? It's happening much faster today. These companies are getting created. They're getting funded, which Jamie can tell us all about. They're getting funded at high levels. They're employing people. They're creating products. People are buying these services at over 300 times faster than just 9 years ago. That's a very fast change in a very short period of time. And now, so there's Michelle, this. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
All of that says as much about capital as it does about the inherent nature of technology and what it can do and why it's transformative. But clearly I cut you off and you were just getting to that. So tell me more.
No, well, no, I think that this is exactly right, where it's the technology was there, but a lot of things have gone a lot easier. It's much simpler to start up a company today. There's cloud computing that makes this enablable. Before, it would take 90 days to get a server to get something online. Now you can do it in 5 minutes. I mean, and by the way, you can make sure it's safe and fast because of services like ours. Like, it's so much simpler. And some of these things are free. You can do all this for free, and you only start to pay if it's much bigger. So the point is that it's accelerated a ton, and there's all these people building things. You're like, wow, what's going to happen now? It will take 10 years or at least 5 before we see the people who are building things now start to appear in publications like The Economist. Because The Economist isn't writing about the people starting with ideas now, because a lot of them fail. But that's part of the game. But a lot of them won't, and they'll become the next big thing 5, 10 years from now. They'll be the next Googles, next Facebooks, next Cloudflares. And we'll be like, wow, they had 10 years earlier. And so it's happening a lot faster. So there's just this groundswell. And then you layer in 5G, which is just one piece of it. It's just a piece, but it is a piece. And you think, okay, well, now the smartphones can handle it. Before they couldn't. 2 years ago, they didn't even receive the 5G signal, but now they do, both the Samsung Galaxy and the iPhones. These different IoT devices, people are building in the Intels of the world are building it into their chips. So like the supply chain is building it in so that the industrious companies can take advantage of it. And so I think we're going to start to see it. The crumbs, the foundation, the seeds have been planted and they're about to blossom. They won't all work. There'll for sure be failures. There'll be setbacks. There'll be things that are difficult. But it's just these things take time, and it's like it's very slow and then it happens really fast all over. Like it's very slow and then it happens quickly. And so I think as humans, we have a hard time of zooming out and zooming in, but like it is happening. And so the question is just, when are we going to read about it on the front page of, again, The Economist?
This week's cover is about global innovation. And what Michelle's talking about is hyperscaling, creating companies that are worth tens of billions of dollars. Now, if we do a company that's worth $1 billion, it's kind of quaint. It didn't really work, right? I mean, we're talking about building. No, it is, right? I mean, we're building a 5G company. I think it'll be worth $50 billion easily. And it's hard to imagine 10 years ago, Michelle, right? I mean, and you and Matt, what you built there is incredible, but the scale now and the amount of data, the global operations, it's really about hyperscaling businesses, and 5G will enable that. And I think that's the hidden trick, which I think she's pointing to here.
Now, some of the seeds
it's exciting to listen to you guys, because to me this is really the quintessential strength of the American system, which is that it taps into decentralized initiatives from a diverse array of individuals and a diverse array of ideas. And as Michelle points out, not all of these ideas are going to be successful, but I actually think that failure is an important part of the American system, because failure tells us where we shouldn't go, and it provides really valuable information that is not available, say, if you have a top-down administered system like in China, where the government is going to say, okay, you follow this route or that route. Ultimately, as I pointed out, innovation is a process, and it's an unknowable process. And the way in which we best tap into that process is through free markets and allowing people the ability to engage in trial and error and error and error.
So the seedlings that have been discussed have been things such as standards, and I want to bring David in on that issue to talk about some of the substrata. But we also talked about the killer app. So before I talk to David about standards, I want to talk to David and bring him into the conversation again and talk about the killer app. What do you think that might be? Have you been thinking about these issues for a really long time? What does your imagination tell you?
Yeah, well, Ken, I think it comes down to data. The revolution that 5G is bringing is about moving data around, lots and lots and lots of data at much faster rates. And when you can do that, you can enable real-time decision support for all manner of decisions that humans are trying to make. And so that includes autonomous driving, which has already been mentioned. That's an obvious killer app kind of a use case. a decision that's basically a decision support tool, deciding which routes to take and deciding how to drive a vehicle. But it's all the other decisions we make. It's the decisions I make as I go to get on the subway to go to and from work here in New York City, and the real-time support that'll enable me to finally make the very best decisions about which path to take, just getting to work, about which is the best restaurant to go to, based on many factors, pardon me, that are, we've got some support for those now, but we don't really have real time, data-driven support. Now we'll have that kind of support. I think we'll see not one killer app, but many killer apps. Some will be entertainment, and I think, Michelle mentioned a little bit of that, and some will be, critical infrastructure, like moving things around. But there'll be many other decisions that we now make on an imperfect basis, or don't make at all. I choose random paths in some of the things I do because I have no basis upon which to make a good decision. That'll all radically change with many killer apps that will support decision making.
I think there's a killer app right in front of us, and we're suffering it today. There's about $200 billion of lost productivity every year in America because of poor connectivity. And I think that's the killer app. That's the first killer app. That's a $200 billion marketplace straight out of the gate. And then from that, you can start doing more sophisticated applications.
What are we going to connect? What, I mean, cars I totally get.
Oh, people to offices, remote workforces. Right now, we're running an internet infrastructure that's, as Michelle pointed out, is 38 years old. Most of the hardware is 25 to 30 years old. You talk to anyone under 30, you ask about networking, they think about Facebook. They don't think about internet protocols. I mean, I think the whole thing has to be ripped out and replaced. We have a lousy internet infrastructure in the country, poor connectivity, poor activity, and it costs U.S. industry about $200 billion a year in lost productivity. I think that's an amazing killer app right out of the gate.
So, Jamie, I want to ask you. I want to ask you whether you think that all of these resources will be available equally across the country in rural areas as well as in urban areas.
Probably not. They never have been. There's no reason why you can't. If you look at South Dakota, they've done North Dakota, they've done an incredible job with broadband across the state. Hats off to the governor there, who Dan Bergen, who is an ex-Microsoft employee. So it is possible to have it, but likely no. But should we address that? Yes. But realistically, there ought to be a way to have relatively low cost, tremendous broadband to enable the remote workers, and then education and other applications to fall behind it. But it's kind of a no-brainer to start with. And then you think, what can people do when they have more bandwidth? Well, the creative geniuses will flow, right? But it's like a screaming no-brainer right in front of us, Ken. Yeah.
Let me press you on this, Jamie. Because I think it's so interesting in terms of what Zorina said about failure and what David has said about experimentation. So what is the most crazy, ridiculous idea around 5G that's come on your desk that you did not fund?
Well, Facebook was one years ago. I mean, look, I did a whole series for another media company and all the deals I didn't do. So I think right now it's just hard to judge, what Metaverse is going to be. I think there's a lot of work in what we would call digital twins, which is trying to simulate industrial environments in the metaverse to look for areas where there may be predicting maintenance issues, years out or weeks out, days out. For example, what it might cost you $10,000 or a couple $1,000 to repair a part on a turbine engine, but if it fails, it costs you $50 million, and to be able to simulate that. And I think just making all that stuff work is still, is years away. But with 5G, be able to connect the intelligence at the edge, having a sensor on every device to know in real time safety, environmental data, waste data, is kind of way out there. So we've done a lot of stuff around energy usage and military systems, and it just takes a while to get it to work. But I think ultimately those will be very big markets. Yeah.
Who's going to be the sort of the winner in 5G, whether it comes to a consumer application or an industrial infrastructure? Not just the tool makers, but sort of the layer on top of it, the applications. And then also in terms of the countries. The US-China rivalry in tech is clearly in 5G as well. We see that unfolding. Who has some views on this? Michelle, it looks like you're nodding.
I'd like to say, I'd like to
Zorina,
say that decision makers in top-down systems, like in China, like to think of technological innovation as a zero-sum game. And unfortunately, here in the US, we see policymakers increasingly adopting this. And I think that it's important not just because of getting the analogy right, but because it has very real implications for the sorts of policies that are going to be implemented. So technology is not a race. It's not a zero-sum race with winners and losers, with a single winner and everyone else being a loser. History shows that this is a very false analogy. And in particular, in decentralized free markets, everyone can be a winner. So if policymakers adopt this model that to be the leader and we have to win the race, then they're very likely to distort markets in the vain hope of hobbling competitors like China. And in that case, then everyone loses. Both in terms of 5G and generally, I feel that American firms are going to succeed best if they can productively collaborate with both domestic and foreign firms overseas. And in particular, I think that, as Michelle pointed out, 5G is not something that is going to end innovation. It's not the end of innovation. There is a whole future process of innovations that are going to be appearing. And even if one country or one industry doesn't, quote unquote, win the race, there are still going to be lots of opportunities to the forthcoming markets.
I'd give Ken a shorter answer. I'd say Korea, Japan, US, France, Germany, Northern Italy, and UK, companies like Schneider, Honeywell, JCI, formerly Johnson Controls, people who control the technology stack. There's huge opportunities, and a lot of great Korean and Japanese and German companies as well, like Bosch or Yokohama in Japan, or LS in Korea. So great companies out there, and they work globally, and it's just a huge opportunity, this whole fourth industrial revolution. I think 5G will make it happen. It's a great opportunity.
Jamie, I can't help but notice you've mentioned every single country that purchases arms from NATO defense contractors.
Well, there's a certain intellectual property umbrella around those countries in the U.S. for collaboration on critical technologies, including artificial intelligence and the things that enable this. Yeah.
You've said Australia.
Well, I think China's going to do their own thing.
Now you're in the Asia Pacific. You're going to say New Zealand after that, and then you're going to give me the whole.
No, I'm not going to name New Zealand. I'm not going to name New Zealand, but I would say Australia is trying to be independent technically as well. Look, I think you have certain critical technologies that won't be exported to China anymore. I think the curtain came down on that a few years ago. The Chinese have their own technological view of the world, their own architecture they're going to pursue, and there'll be areas of influence that they have. And countries are going to choose between one or the other, and it's becoming more and more apparent. Yeah.
Well, I just wonder if.
Well, and Jamie,
please.
I was just going to say, Jamie, you pick those countries. You pick those countries and those companies. You pick the countries because those are the countries that are serious about rolling out the 5G infrastructure. They're making the CapEx, the capital investments to upgrade their networks to support 5G, and then you pick those companies because they're industrial companies that hopefully can take advantage and will deploy the internal resources and capital to say, we got to get this offline process connected to now this 5G network that the country set up to get productivity gains or lower cost, better quality that we can then pass along to our chain. I think and those countries are the furthest along in the rolling out, so it's probably a good bet.
Yeah.
I'm so surprised because you would think that the world's second largest economy, but one which will probably supersede the United States in the next decade, is and has in certain measures as well already, will be the one that will unveil a sort of a dominance, if not the predominance, in 5G. And they're going to try to export it as well, as they've been exporting all their other kit. And so you're going to have companies in France having to decide between Schneider, Siemens, and Huawei, right? That they're going to have to decide whether they're going to be part of the ecosystem of the West or if they're going to be part of the ecosystem of Chinese technology. It seems like that's going to be a dominant area as well.
Well, the Chinese state is investing heavily in 5G infrastructure, and they're buying equity in new ventures and offering whopping subsidies to their domestic firms. But the data show that it's unclear that these actions are significantly adding to their productivity. I frankly think that, as I said, we can all be winners, and that these sorts of us versus them models are counterproductive. It leads the US to place artificial barriers against competitors like Huawei and ZTE. And if policymakers distort global markets in the vain hope of sort of hobbling Chinese competition, then we're all going to bear the losses. I mean, it's Econ 101 that those sorts of policies, those sort of beggar thy neighbor policies, are ultimately counterproductive. And in terms of 5G technologies, at one point, the US was the leader in 4G, and China was supposed to be way behind us. And now here we are talking about China being the one to catch up to. So any particular technology is not destiny, and in order to keep ourselves in the game, we have to collaborate rather than place barriers.
I think we have to collaborate, but I think the Chinese represent it's an existential threat to the West in many ways, and I think it's naive to say that they played on a fair ground with us in terms of IP and trade. I think that's complete nonsense, And I could we do things better here in the U.S. with better trade packs? Yes, the not doing the trade pack in the Pacific was a big mistake. Can we, collaborate more with our other Western countries? Yeah, but for the most part, we have a real issue with China and IP theft. Huawei was built completely on pilfered technology from Cisco. Even the errors in the code were stolen from Cisco. I mean, the Economist has a bird's eye view of this as well. Ken,
We're at a situation right now, we're at a crossroads in which a new infrastructure is being laid out. And there is a lot of opportunity. We can quibble over the degree to which there's a rivalry and who's going to win that rivalry. But what is absolutely certain is that we're on the cusp of something big. Regulation restricts growth as well as enables development. What is the agenda for regulators in a 5G universe? What is the first thing on their list that they need to do?
I would tell you, Ken, the first thing regulators should do, I hope we'll continue to do in the U.S., is stand back and let markets develop. I think one of the reasons the U.S. has done so well in technology leadership is that we have not taken an approach, no action until regulation is in place. And instead, we've taken an approach of let 1,000 flowers bloom, let's see what issues come up, and then we'll figure out how to regulate them later. I believe that is super important in being responsible for the U.S. leading in many technologies. And I certainly hope we continue to do that with 5G.
Okay.
I agree with David 110%. I think that having open markets without artificial barriers are the way to go. And in particular, the best thing that government can do is to remove the obstacles that it is placing itself in the way of innovative firms. For instance, one of the biggest problems in 5G is access to needed spectrum. And here you see that the reallocation of spectrum to the private sector is very slow and unwieldy. It needs to be implemented more efficiently if we're going to have firms getting the infrastructure they need to be innovative. And I would also point to a topic that I hope we'll discuss later, which is appropriate intellectual property policies.
Okay. So we've got two highly deregulatory approaches to what regulators need to do to enable the growth of this infrastructure. Let me probe this a little bit more, because as someone who, like you, is of a certain age, we all share that growing up, and we remember the internet as it was emerging and coming up. There was an absolute belief that as an infant industry, as the argument goes, it needed to be sort of unencumbered with the business models and the regulations of yesteryear, so that it could flourish. But maybe that ethos, as well-meaning as it was for innovation, is too exaggerated, because we have all these pathologies of the internet, like misinformation and security vulnerabilities. Maybe we actually do need regulators to put a little bit of muscle in and sort of and define things a little bit more right now. Do we? Are you sure that we really just want to ask them to steer clear of this?
Yeah, I really think it's impossible for regulators to step in and try and create the technology or the infrastructure that will solve, Ken, problems you're talking about, like security and misinformation. That's got to be left to discussions later on, or public-private partnership approaches, like I remember seeing when the internet was coming up in the 1990s and really becoming de rigueur, which worked extremely well. Those approaches that leverage the knowledge of the private sector, responsible actors in the technology sphere, and help government to do the right thing, not over-regulate, but step in only where it makes sense, I believe are really the right approaches. And I think I would grant you 0.0% chance of the government being able to get it right. And this isn't a knock on the government. I worked in the government for a number of years myself. Not a knock on the government, but to say it's just impossible for people inside the government to come in and fix problems like, 5G security or, 5G misinformation.
But is there anything that you want from government then, other than contracts for the infrastructure and these public-private sector initiatives? Is there anything that we need from government?
Well, I think you want a competitive landscape in the U.S., so you have multiple vendors innovating. We appear to have, a handful of global telcos, and I think you go back to 1996, and you had the act then that started the whole process. So I think you want to keep a competitive environment. I think in terms of innovation itself, whenever we talk about building companies in America, it's all about human capital, and I think that's a big area that it's easy to gloss over. But I'm sure Michelle's biggest challenge is probably people, right? If you're scaling up, just getting really good engineering talent. I know Qualcomm, our sponsors, helped create one of the biggest engineering school on the West Coast, the Jacobs School of Engineering down at UC San Diego, and over 6,500 computer science and cog sci students, and we need more of that. We need the talent to do what we set out to do. Spectrum, I think, has been awkward. I've been in that role for 20 years. The government plays a big role there in enabling innovation by making the spectrum available. It's also been a big source of revenue for them. So it's those are some of the areas I see. Not stifling innovation. Look, we need to have great relationships with a number of other countries around the world for free trade and IP exchange, with and look, there's some huge opportunities here. That's all I'd say.
Okay.
Okay, I'll add some to the list. I'll add a couple. Can I add a couple of things to the list? So, I'm enjoying this conversation. A couple of things I'd add to the list. What I would love to see from our administration is an acknowledgement around how important the internet and technology is to us as a country and the innovators, and to unite people around it. I think that there is a little bit of your point that you're pushing us on here, Ken, around, oh my God, but they need to do something about the misinformation because it's not perfect. Internet reflects us as humans. And it turns out humans are imperfect. You see all the amazing things, but you see the really ugly things too, the gossip, saying mean things. But those happen offline too. And the technology kind of amplifies that. And I think right now there's a lot of negativity towards tech and the internet. It'd be great to get back to it. We are way better off because of this. We are able to do a lot more, and it's not going away. We got to embrace it, and we got to fix the things that we've learned along the way and whatnot, and make sure everyone is coming along too, having equal opportunity. That we want everyone to come along. We want people to participate. So retooling and all these sorts of things. It'd be great to get more computer science programming into schools, because back to this point is it's so important. It's not going away. It doesn't matter if you're not going to become an engineer one day, but understanding the basics of how it works, what the language is, and how both the internet works, how computer programs are written. You'll be able to communicate better in your next career, in your career, if you understand the basics, just like we understand the basics of math or physics or chemistry. It'd be great to have more on that of content earlier in the school system, so that we're educating all our population in a really smart way. So those are two things that I would add. And then the third thing I would add, which you'd brought it up earlier in cybersecurity, and that's one of the areas that I know a lot about, is it would be great if, and this is not just the US government, many governments around the world, were tougher on when people do malicious things online. There should be tougher penalties for when there is bad behavior online. Like when there's really crimes being created, there should be tougher penalties. And because it's not going to go away, just like you can walk down the street and get pickpocketed anywhere you live. People's homes are getting broken into, but there's tougher penalties depending where you live. And we need similar, because again, these things aren't going to go away. They're getting better. I'm a big believer that it's going to get better, but they're not going to go away. And so we need that the consequences for bad behavior online in a way that's appropriate with the bad act.
Zorina, please.
Yes, I agree entirely with Michelle that the appropriate role for government is not necessarily in the realm of the economy or economics, but in terms of formulating rules to protect security and to protect consumer data and rights of privacy. Because the advent of 5G and the Internet of Things hold, of course, the promise of widespread benefits, but they also raise the specter of an anti-democratic loss of individual autonomy. And I think that the most significant challenge of 5G integration is going to be the threat to individual privacy and security, because businesses can always make investments to protect themselves against infringement with regard to their data and their property. But consumers are going to need far greater transparency and agency to ensure responsible use of their data and information. And it's sort of curious to think about the right to privacy, because the right to privacy was invented out of whole cloth by Brandeis in 1890 to counter the threat of new technologies and the way they are corrosive to individual privacy. And I think that right to privacy that was formulated in 1890 needs to be updated for 2021 and beyond.
I'm so glad you brought it up. I think it's actually a perfect place to end because, in fact, as you know, Europe is thinking long and hard. It's already implemented some privacy rules that seem to be modernizing our standards. They're looking at artificial intelligence, and I can only imagine that they're going to do exactly as we've done in our panel today, is look at all the different strands of the issues, whether it's intellectual property, which we've spoken about, whether it's cybercrime, which we've spoken about, whether it's privacy, whether it's standards, and they're going to try to bring it all together, including free trade as well, and standards and privacy can be a restriction trade as well. Bring it all together and try to see if there's a way that we can actually enable this technology to flourish by getting some of the regulations out of the way, but also by hardening things like what Michelle said, which is if there's crime coming in, that we should actually prosecute it and do well with it. Now, sadly, although these are such critical issues that open up the door to entirely new domains that really need to be considered, we are out of time. And so we don't have time to delve more into it. So let me give lots of thanks. So first, of course, we want to thank our listeners today who've been with us and participating by watching this incredible conversation that we've had. I'd like to thank you, all of you, the panelists, which is David Kappos, Michelle Zatlyn, Zorina Khan, and Jamie Montgomery, for your very thoughtful remarks that sort of have crystallized a lot of these issues for me. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Qualcomm. As you know, when I'm not moderating these really interesting comments, we're also producing journalism as a team. You can go to economist.com and you can listen to my podcast, Babbage, which is available via economist.com. If you're not a subscriber, please do subscribe. And the show continues because, of course, we've got more sessions as well when we think about the 5G economy and all that it means for society. So stay tuned for the next program.